Hello. So this session doesn't look quite like the others because when I was doing this talk at the center, I forgot to press the record button. And so this is a makeup recording. So we can join all the others on our channel. Let's see. Let me pull up my notes here. So this is our first meeting in January. And in December, where we left off, we were talking about what nirvana was, or mostly what it wasn't. And we were trying to figure out, is nirvana some kind of stupendous mystical blessing that sends you floating away on waves of bliss? Or, is nirvana just growing up for real? Is nirvana just about finding a reference point or some still place within yourselves that will keep you from getting knocked off course and confused all the time? Or is nirvana being able to find some source of contentment within ourselves so that we don't have to wander through life like an empty cup, just hoping that we get filled up somehow? So there's lots of ways to think about nirvana and how it solves the problem of life. There was a fellow named M. Scott Peck who he wrote The Road Less Traveled. That was his famous one. But in one of his books about community, he had a group that split themselves into two sections. And one group called themselves the Holy Grailers, and the other group was the Sears Roebuckers. And I think you always find that, some people are looking for a transcendent experience, and other people just want to know how to live in the world with some degree of sanity. Of course, I like both of those things. I want both. I want the mystical stuff. I want the peace that passeth all understanding, as Brother Paul would say. And I'd like to have some way to get through the day without feeling like everything's pointless, right? Because existential angst is a drag. So that's what we did then. So tonight, or today rather, we're going to talk more about the Eightfold Path. And before we launch into the second fold of the Eightfold Path, I want to talk a little bit about how the path works, what it is and what it isn't. I would say that Buddhism is not like being a professional ballet dancer. It's not something that you either have to be able to do it basically perfectly, or there's no point in even trying. You hear Buddhists obsessing about whether they're doing their meditation right or getting some part of the practice right, and they just don't know if they're going to be able to make Buddhism work because they're just not very good at it, and it's just too much, right? But obsessing about technique, that's one of those fetters that we talked about. The third fetter of attachment, there's attachment to your self-view, doubt about the path. And the third one is attachment to rites and rituals, which is to say it's thinking that by perfectly following some set of instructions, you're going to really do something for your spiritual life. I'd say Buddhism is not that kind of thing. To me, Buddhism is more like woodworking in the sense that there's lots of ways to carve wood. You can turn a piece of wood on a lathe, or you can just hold it in your hands and carve it with a knife. Be sure and carve away from you, right? That's always the secret there. Or you can like sand it down, with sanding paper and stuff. It doesn't matter how you work the wood as long as you get it in the right shape. And it's the same with Buddhism. It doesn't matter exactly how you practice your Buddhism as long as you figure out a way to peel yourself off of this world and off of your own clinging without hardening your heart, right? In Buddhism, you're walking this middle path. You don't cling, but you're not just a stone. You're not unfeeling towards others. It's that middle way. But, when you're able to not spend your energy clinging to things all the times or pushing them away, then you're sort of free to be who you really are, instead of the false self that the world and our own ignorance are always trying to turn us into. So anyway, Buddhism is about finding that freedom, and it comes from just understanding, seeing the way things really are. And there's lots of ways to get there. Buddhism just provides a lot of really good hints. Let's see. So how did the Buddha describe the path, though? That's a question. And the Buddha described the path this way. It's just as if a man traveling along a wilderness track were to see an ancient path, an ancient road traveled by people of former times. He would follow it. Following it, he would see an ancient city, an ancient capital, inhabited by people of former times, complete with parks, groves, and ponds, walled and delightful. He would go to address the king, Or the king's minister, the Pali canon's sort of fussy about these things. Well, what if the king's busy? Well, see the minister, so the king or the king's minister, and he would say, "Sire, you should know that while traveling along the wilderness track, I saw this ancient path and I followed it. I found an ancient city, an ancient capital, complete with parks, groves, ponds, walled, delightful. Sire, rebuild that city." The king or the king's minister would rebuild the city so that at a later date, the city would become powerful, rich, and well populated, fully grown, and prosperous. And so the Buddha says, in the same way, I saw an ancient path, an ancient road traveled by the rightly self-awakened ones. That's the former Buddhas. There are lots of Buddhas before the Buddha we know about. They were self-awakened. They didn't need somebody else to teach them. So he saw this road traveled by the rightly self-awakened ones of former times. And what is that ancient path, that ancient road? Just this noble Eightfold Path. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. That is the ancient path, the ancient road. I followed that path. So what the Buddha is saying is that this was not a new thing. That's the Buddhism understanding of itself is that this is all old news. It just had been forgotten, and the Buddha reintroduced it. But this is the way people have always been supposed to live. Buddhism isn't a set of instructions or principles. The Buddhism is a world that you start living in. It's that city where you are finally able to live in a way that works for both the heart and the mind. That's how I think of it. A city where you can finally stop fighting yourself and fighting with the world. So what does this mean? So to me, Buddhism is something that you steep yourself in like tea. You marinate in it till it soaks all the way through you. It's something that you study and you think about, and you carry it into every situation you run into all day long. Now, meditation is important and understanding the teachings are important, but what really matters in the end is your inner environment, that feeling tone of your heart and your mind as you go through the day. Have you managed to relax that white knuckle grip? Do you feel a sense of freedom just a little bit when you're able to let go of things in the right way? You have to start with using techniques because you have to start somewhere, but eventually Buddhism is more about intuition than technique. You'll know when you're doing it right because it'll feel right. Mindfulness and virtue will become your refuge from the chaos. They'll become your source of happiness. So, what now? Once you get past right understanding, which is what we've been talking about for weeks with karma and the Four Noble Truths, that all is in the first step of the Eightfold Path, right understanding. Once you're past that, really the rest of the path is about what I would call taming the mind. And taming the mind is mostly about softening up our sense of self so that we're not trapped by our very militant and ignorant demands and cravings. But for some people, it has a little different flavor. It's not about their demands and their cravings. For some people, taming the mind is about not being trapped by their constant self-effacement and fear of standing out. There's some people who love to stand up on the stage and say, look at me. And others are hiding in the bathroom saying, don't look at me, pay no attention. And both of these sorts of people are obsessed with self-view, just in different ways. Some people are proud of themselves and some people are embarrassed about themselves, but it's all about the self and managing our self-view. So here we are in the second fold of the Eightfold Path, right intention. Intention is a key to Buddhist practice, because the things you do intentionally are the things that reflect your goals, right? Intuition controls how we apply our efforts. And in Buddhism, our intentional actions are what creates our karma. And so intuition is important. Intuition influences our mind. How do you change your daily habits? You have to have an intention all the time to do things a different way. So intention affects the top layer of your mind, the conscious part that we're aware of, but intention can also influence the deeper parts of our mind. The Buddha didn't talk about the unconscious. That wasn't really a thing then, but there were similar ideas in Buddhism. But the way this works is that you can literally transform yourselves from top to bottom, conscious and unconscious if you apply your intention in the right way. I mean, that's what purification is all about. And, I'm never sure about using the word purification because it sort of sounds like, you're going to be pure, which really means fake, But that's why I like to talk about taming the mind. It's not purification in some sort of Sunday school rules kind of way. It's purification, and really in the sense of getting rid of the poisons, and having a healthier mind. So what's that all about? Right intention has 3 parts to it, and we're going to talk about the first part. The first is metta, which is the Sanskrit word, and it's translated as loving kindness. A lot of times you'll hear it, and you'll also hear it translated as goodwill. And those are 2 different flavors, but one sometimes works for people better than the other. But the second part of right intention is renunciation, which we've touched on already. We'll come back to it. And the third part of right intention is nonviolence. Ahimsa, is the Sanskrit word. And of course, that's very important in Hinduism and other religions as well. So we got metta, the loving kindness, we got renunciation and nonviolence. These intentions are the first step in taming the mind. This is where we start turning away from our defilements, greed, hatred, and delusion. So for our reading, we read chapter 11, Unlimited Friendliness. I had also recommended chapter 7, which I talked about before. That's just Ajahn Chah's discussion, which has to do with renunciation, but we're not going to talk about that yet. And then I gave you the link for Jack Kornfield's meditation, How to Do Meditation on Loving Kindness, and some notes about that. So, metta, what's the deal? Metta is one of those things that's very good to have in your Buddhist toolbox. You often see metta translated as loving kindness, but Bhikkhu Bodhi in particular translates metta as goodwill. And the reason he does this is because people might find it difficult to have loving kindness, to feel all loving and warm about like a poisonous snake. But you can wish a poisonous snake goodwill. You can wish it for it to live its best poisonous snake life, just somewhere besides where you are, right? You both want to live your best life. So that's one thing. And another thing is I don't like to talk about metta without talking about its brothers and sisters. Metta is just the first item in a list of very helpful qualities called the Brahma Viharas. That's one funny name. It's also called the 4 Immeasurables. That's its other funny name. And Brahma Vihara literally means the dwelling place of the gods. Brahma is about gods. Vihara is dwelling place or home, where you abide. So the dwelling place of the gods, what's up with that? And metta is the first one. Well, these qualities are things that Buddhists want to develop within themselves. They're qualities of the heart. We want to embody them and carry them with us into every situation. The 4 immeasurables are the toolbox we use to deal with other people, and we can use it on ourselves. When you're a person, after all, you have to deal with yourself all the time. You should use the toolbox, right? So let's talk about them a little more. Metta. Metta is loving kindness or goodwill for all beings everywhere, without limits, without any distinction. Evil beings are loved just like good beings. So obviously this takes practice. Meditation, metta meditation is a practice that's kind of like playing the scales when you learn piano. Eventually you can play the scales without even thinking about it, just up and down. You don't even have to look at the keys, your scales. And that allows you then to play, sheet music and more difficult pieces of music because you already know where your finger should go, to be in a particular key. And so there's a lot that you don't have to think about, you can just focus more on the music. Well, metta is the same way. Eventually you can learn to have goodwill for every person you encounter without even thinking about it. And when you apply it to yourself, metta is feeling kindness for all of yourself, including the worst parts, the ones you would rather not think about, and accepting all of yourself. Now, metta doesn't mean you approve of everything. It doesn't mean that you think it's right, just that you accept it. You don't push it away. Metta lets everyone sit at the table. So here's a metaphor that Ajahn Amaro talked about way back. Imagine that you have a committee of the mind. that discusses things and makes decisions. It's your board of directors. With Metta, even the worst parts of yourself get to sit at the committee meeting. Now, you don't let the crazier, more antisocial parts of yourself make any final decisions. In this metaphor, wisdom always chairs the committee and makes the final decision. But everybody's at the table, and everybody gets to sort of speak their truth. And I realize that this is the plot of the movie Inside Out, but Buddhists came up with it first. Ajahn Amaro was talking about this in 2001. So if there's any IP questions, we were first. So this is the weird thing about Metta applied to your own mind. It can really change the way you think. It changes the way you deal with your mind in a fundamental way. Metta tends to dissolve the walls and the barriers that we put up within ourselves to stay away from the things we don't want to think about, but all of that melts away, as you apply Metta and mindfulness to your own mind. So it's a powerful thing. And another thing is I have learned over time that different people can experience Metta differently. It's not this gooey, warm-hearted thing for everyone. Now, myself, I have become quite sentimental and easily moved to tears of joy over the years. And I don't know if it's my Buddhist practice or just something that happens to old men sometimes, right? Some old guys just get kind of weepy. But as a young man, though, I was quite bitter and not easily moved to tears at all. And so people are different. Some people's emotional barometer just works differently. So even if you don't have squishy feelings of sappy, warm-hearted love, you can still learn to accept people completely, and you can learn to accept yourself completely. Unconditional acceptance, even radical acceptance, which was the name of a very good book by Tara Brach, Radical Acceptance. That's really the point of Metta. Acceptance is the Buddhist part. So that, like I say, it doesn't mean you approve of everyone or approve of everything in yourself, but you stop rejecting it because it doesn't measure up or something. You accept that you are who you are, failings and bad habits and all, and you accept others in exactly the same way. The key is that you stop fighting and rejecting the way the world is right now in this moment, and you stop rejecting the way you are in this moment. That doesn't mean you can't change things in the future. It just means that you're not going to live in a world of delusion and refuse to accept the world as it is right in front of you. Because the fact is, until you can accept something, you can't really deal with it properly. You can't fix something or manage something that you don't even accept as the truth. And Ajahn Sumedho is always saying about whatever difficult thought or feeling you may be having, he just says it's like this, so intense, murderous frustration is like this, you take a step back and you just recognize it for what it is, and you accept that that's how you feel at the moment, or that's the situation at the moment. Whether you like it or not, that's what it is. And once you do that, of course, the pressure kind of drops, right? It's more manageable. And it's easy to get caught up in this blame game about Metta, because it's a pretty high standard. And so, people will get upset with themselves because they don't feel like they can feel Metta the right way. And Ajahn Sumedho talks about this Anglican priest he knew who was upset with themselves because they couldn't forgive someone. And Sumedho's advice was, well, take a step back. First, you have to have Metta for yourself. You have to forgive yourself for your inability to forgive. Sometimes you just have to accept that you don't measure up to your own standards. But once you can do that and recognize that I should forgive them, but I can't, that's just the way it is right now, it often becomes easier to deal with, the failings of other people, right? Once you can, hold yours in mind with sort of a clear mind and a clear heart. So one thing about the Brahma Viharas is that they have these things called far enemies and near enemies. Now, with Metta, the far enemy, the thing that's most unlike Metta, is hatred or ill will, anger, contempt. Those are the opposite of Metta. Pretty easy to distinguish which side somebody's on there. But metta has near enemies that are things that look like metta, but they're not quite metta for one reason or another. And one of those things is, well, if metta is unconditional love, you love all beings, good or bad, regardless, then, you can also have conditional love, which is how love tends to work in the real world. It's like, yes, I love you as long as you love me, or at least pretend to, but, as long as I'm getting something out of it, then yes, I'm committed and loving and all of that. But, let's not be ridiculous. So that's conditional love, right? And then, of course, there's preferential love. Metta is love for everyone, or goodwill towards all beings everywhere. But, for most people, love extends to, well, no, I just love you. Everybody else can take a hike, this is all I can manage, Or another way that you see that is, well, yes, I love and accept everyone as long as they're in my group, because people who are outside of my group, well, and it's when you get into that thing where it's like, well, do you really think of those people as human beings if they're not in your group? It gets very suspicious. But yeah, it's easy. Most people's love is going to not extend everywhere. It's going to be preferential. So that's a near enemy of metta: conditional love and preferential love. Another problem people have is when is just sentimentality. They sort of, they say they love other people, but what they really love is kind of their own idea of them being this wonderful being who loves all other beings. They're just kind of wrapped up in their own self-image, and they're not really looking at the other person. They just want to be the sort of person who has metta, and that's how they think of themselves. So they're just sort of sentimental about it. So that's another one. So the last near enemy is just, if you have metta for yourself, but it's the kind of thing where you're saying, of course I love myself. I'm just the best thing ever. How could you not love me? I mean, I have all this metta, right? I must be lovable. I must be the best. So, metta is not supposed to be this kind of, Stuart Smalley, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, doggone it, people like me. Like I say, the focus of metta with yourself a lot of times is around acceptance, that you accept the parts of yourself that you really don't want other people to know about, but you know about them, and you have to accept them to be able to deal with yourself properly. So that's metta, has near enemies and far enemies. The next thing on the list of our 4 immeasurables, or our Brahma Viharas, is compassion. And the Sanskrit word is karuna. Now, our word compassion, comes from the word passion, which actually, kind of relates to suffering, and that sounds weird. It's like passion. I thought that was about love or whatever, but, like the Passion of the Christ, that meant suffering in that context. But Buddhist karuna, Buddhist compassion, it's not about suffering with, it's to be moved by another being suffering, moved to help them. If you just sit down and cry along with somebody who's crying, that's probably not going to do them a lot of good. Now you just have 2 sad people. They're reinforcing each other's sadness. And I will just say, as a little aside, when somebody is in an emotional state, they're crying, they're falling apart, they can't get it together, it's often not helpful to just come in and say, oh, well, what you need to do is just X, Y, Z. Let me fix that for you. And then there's no need to cry. That's not really what people want in that situation anyway. What they want, or what really helps them, is for somebody to just sit down and maybe just be a silent witness, just sit next to them, and as they go through their difficulties, and that's strangely helpful, because then they have this, they know that there's someone who is with them, someone who's not trying to fix anything, and who's not, feeding off their own upset and being upset themselves. It's somebody who's being there for, to rely on. And that often is the best thing to help people kind of get to the other side of whatever they're going through. But anyway, so where were we? Compassion is to be there for someone in whatever way is most helpful to that person. That's what's important. Whether they actually need help solving a problem, or just a sympathetic ear, what can you do? That's what the compassionate person asks. And another thing is, you'll hear this term idiot compassion when you hang around in Buddhist circles sometimes. And idiot compassion, this comes from the idea that you have to have some amount of wisdom to be truly compassionate. Wisdom and compassion go together and support one another. So it's also true that you can't be truly wise without having some compassion. That's the other side of it. But yeah, idiot compassion is just, it's more of this useless sentimentality again. Because if you're not be able to approach the situation with wisdom, with a clear understanding of what's going on with this person, you can't help them very effectively. So we want to be wisely compassionate, not idiot compassion people. So, what are the far and near enemies of compassion? Well, the far enemy, as you might have guessed, is cruelty, harm. The opposite of caring for someone is hurting them. And so that's pretty straightforward. The near enemy of compassion, and there's two of these, are a little tricky. The one is pity. And you might think that, well, pity sounds like compassion. What's the problem? But in the Buddhist understanding, the problem with pity is that you're putting the person beneath you, that you are coming in as the savior, and they are, the person that you're going to swoop in and rescue. But the idea of compassion in the Buddhist sense is you're on equal terms. That, yeah, this time the other person may need help, they may need your compassion, but next time it'll be you that needs help, and they'll be there for you. And so you want to see yourself as, as kalyana mitta, as we say, spiritual friends, not, someone that you have to take care of because they can't manage themselves or anything like that. So pity is one near enemy that kind of has the wrong flavor for compassion, karuna. And the other one, it's called grief. And what they mean is it's sort of more of the sentimental problem that you see someone suffering and you're feeling it so much that you are suffering along with them. And so now you're not in a good position to help. You're focused on your own feelings rather than what the other person really needs. You're not able to bring your wisdom to bear as to what's really going on. You're just caught up in your own feelings. So pity and grief, the two near enemies of compassion. So the third immeasurable, the third Brahma Vihara, is translated into English. It's called sympathetic joy. And the Pali word and the Sanskrit word, I believe they're the same, is mudita, sympathetic joy. So what does this mean, sympathetic joy? It means that you are being happy for another person's good fortune. So another person is having a good day, or something good has happened for them, and you are happy for them. You're feeling joy because someone else is happy and doing well. And that's even if they aren't close to you and you didn't benefit at all from any of this. This is just their thing. They're happy for their own reasons. And you, as feeling mudita, as a Buddhist, sympathetic joy, you are happy for them. And this, this gets trickier and trickier, right? Even if someone you don't particularly like gets a reward or recognition that you thought you deserved, and now they're all smiling and happy and celebrating with their friends, you should be happy for them. It's a challenge. And so there's a few questions around this. One is, what if someone is happy because they're doing something wrong? They're happy because they're being immoral, or they managed to avoid some punishment that they should have gotten, and they're happy about that. So should we be happy for them? Should we be happy for criminals? And a Buddhist approach is to kind of take the long range view of things, because Buddhism is all about the long-term view. And, ultimately, Buddhism understands that while a bad person might live a successful life and they might die peacefully in their sleep, surrounded by their loved ones and all that, at some point they will suffer for what they have done, that their karma will return to them one way or the other at some point in the future. And so the Buddhist response for that, of course, is compassion. You are harming yourself and you don't even realize it. And I feel compassion for the suffering you're eventually going to have to go through. And even if you just look at this life, someone who enjoys cruelty, who derives pleasure from seeing others suffer, there is something not right with them, right? They're not well. And so whether they seem happy or not, they're still sick in the head, in a sense. And so in that sense, they need compassion instead of sympathetic joy. You don't have to feel sympathetic joy for people who are making the world worse. That's not the goal of sympathetic joy. And of course, with all of these, that you want to develop a loving heart and to help people and be happy for people. But this, ultimately, metta is a practice for you to change yourself. And so there's no need to encourage immorality in your meditation practice. So compassion for people who can't manage themselves and are doing wrong things. Mudita, sympathetic joy for people who are just, things are working for them. And so that, they're doing the right things and things are going their way. And so you can be happy in their happiness. So as you might imagine, there's some interesting far enemies and near enemies. Well, some obvious far enemies. What's obviously not sympathetic joy? That would be envy. You are craving having what someone else has, that you would rather have it instead of them, or at least in addition to them. So envy is one. Jealousy, a very obvious one. There's something that you thought you were going to get, but somebody else got it. And now they're benefiting from it and you are not, whether it's, they got something, they got the new job that you were both trying for, or they're getting attention from someone that you thought should pay attention to you. So jealousy, obviously. Far enemy of mudita, this sympathetic joy. And then the Germans gave us Schadenfreude, right? Happiness because of someone else's unhappiness. That's what we're, when the other person's doing that, that's what we don't want to feel mudita for. We want to feel compassion because something's not right with them. But when you feel happiness at another person's happiness, that's clearly a far enemy of sympathetic joy. So those are the far enemies: envy, jealousy, Schadenfreude. So what about near enemies? So there's a couple, and one of them, which you might have thought of immediately when we started talking about this, hypocrisy. Someone is happy, you're supposed to be happy for them, and so you just put up a false front. Oh, I'm so happy for you. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy. Yeah. So there's that, obviously. And of course, it's not really mudita. So, but to other people, they think, oh, well, he is happy for his friend that he competes with or whatever. Well, this is great. Everybody's happy now. You're putting on an act to make it appear that you are feeling mudita. So hypocrisy is a near enemy. The other near enemy is called exhilaration. And I wasn't familiar with this one until recently. But exhilaration, and this is really sort of an ego boundary thing. It's another one of these where you're kind of wrapped up in yourself instead of the other person. But what exhilaration is about is you're just going along with this person's happiness for the rush that it's giving you. That you're not feeling very happy about things, but you can sort of participate in their happiness to fill yourself up. So kind of like you're having a little ego boundary problem there. You're going, or maybe you're just sort of parasitic. You're going to enjoy their happiness because it's the only happiness around. You don't seem to have any, and so you are just being exhilarated with them, but you're not really happy for them. You would still rather that it was really your own happiness. So near enemies, hypocrisy and exhilaration, near enemies for sympathetic joy. So there's just one more. The fourth immeasurable, the fourth Brahma Vihara is equanimity. And equanimity is staying centered, remaining composed, even when chaos is swirling around you. Equanimity allows you to keep your balance and to keep using your wisdom and to keep using your Buddhist understanding to deal with things and not just get swept up in either the excitement or the fear that's going on that other people are dealing with. So equanimity helps balance out the other Brahma Viharas so that they don't overpower you. They don't cause you to grasp and cling and get unbalanced about things. It helps keep your unconditional love unconditional because you're looking at everything with the same wise attention. You're not getting caught up and becoming heedless in how you're responding to things. You're keeping your wisdom. And so in the Brahma Viharas, metta gets all the attention. Everybody loves metta. Metta's great. But equanimity is really just as important as far as the overall Buddhist path is concerned. Equanimity is part of some other important lists, and it's obviously a quality that Buddhists should be able to develop, that being able to sort of stand your ground and stay in place when all the world is crumbling about you. This is a sign that you're not being swept up in your defense of the self and all those other things that happen from self-view and sort of spiritual immaturity. So equanimity, very important. So far enemy and near enemy. The far enemy of equanimity is considered to be sort of some of the problem children from the other Brahma Viharas, like, it's love and hate. So the wrong kind of love, possessive love, selfish love, conditional love, preferential love, when you're picking and choosing and saying, well, I like you better than you, that's not equanimity. You're not extending the Brahma Viharas to everyone equally. You're not responding to your environment equally. So that's one, the wrong sort of love. And then hatred is always wrong. So hatred is also not equanimity. So you're either preferentially pulling some things to you, or you're pushing things you don't like away from you. Those are the far enemies of equanimity. And the near enemy of equanimity, and this is a really good one, and it's important. The near enemy of equanimity is indifference. And I don't mean indifference like to your environment. That's actually a very good Buddhist thing, to not get knocked off course just by the weather around you, either the actual weather or, the chaos or confusion that's going on. If the gain and, the 8 worldly winds come into play here, if you can be indifferent to gain and loss and having a good and bad reputation and pain and pleasure and all of that, if you can laugh and shrug your shoulders because your house burned down, you will get the gold star for equanimity. You are not being buffeted about just by the vicissitudes of life, by the things that happen. But that's about things and situations. If you are indifferent about other people's suffering, that is not equanimity. And it's not just, that kind of indifference is not just indifference. It's really more like contempt. You are rejecting someone's suffering as being not even worthy of your notice. You in your fake Buddhism, your fake equanimity, you're like, oh, I'm just so above it all. I'm just so equanimous, and I'm not, buffeted around and confused by anything. So these suffering people, they don't have any effect on me at all. I'm just a rock. That is not equanimity. That is just contempt, or that's this indifference. So far enemies, the wrong kind of love, possessive love, conditional love. Any sort of hatred is, of course, the far enemy of equanimity, the obvious enemy. And then the near enemy, the tricky ones, indifference, and that sort of being unconcerned about people's suffering, contemptuous of it, is really what's behind that. So that's the Brahma Viharas. That's the 4 immeasurables. And so that's all I wanted to cover. And so I thank you very much for listening. And hopefully the next recording will be back in the usual place next week. So until then, take care.